Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part one of our invasive plants webinar series. Today, our webinar is on invasive plants, introduction and impacts with Kelly Cooley. We have a part two on June the 8th with Kathy Roth speaking on conditioning your cows to eat weeds. So if you're interested in that as well, please register. Our collaborating partners in organizing this series are the Foothills Forage Grazing Association with Laura Gibney and Sonia Bloom, Mountain View County with Laura Lee Grattage, and Grey Wooded Forage Association, just myself, Greg Peranich, and the Alberta Conservation Association with Erin Vandermeer. And Erin doesn't have her picture on the screen, but she is joining us with the audio today. Our guest presenter is Kelly Cooley of CoolPro Solutions, where he is helping you make things work. Kelly grew up on a family farm in southwest Alberta near Pincher Creek. Their mixed operation includes native prairie with a view of the Canadian Rockies eastern slopes. Kelly had a long-term service as an agricultural fieldman for the MD of Pincher Creek from 1993 to 2010. Managing agricultural and environmental programs. Kelly just completed his term on the North American Invasive Species Management Association Board of Directors. Kelly is also the Alberta Terrestrial Invasive Species Verifier for the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, working on behalf of AICS-SC and liaison with the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. Kelly lends experience to several organizations, including the Crown Continent Managers Partnership and Landscape Conservation Design Team, Southwest Invasive Managers, and the Alberta Conservation Advisory Committee for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Kelly is an Alberta Environment and Park Certified Trainer of both Authorized Assistant Pesticide Applicator and Farm Pesticide Applicator certification programs. And as of 2021, he is certifying as a technician for the Alberta Environmental Farm Plan Program. So, with no further ado, I will turn it over to Kelly Cooley to continue with our presentation of the day.
Sorry,
Kelly.
Greg, can you just actually run through the housekeeping real quick?
Oh, thank you, Sonia. I'm glad we have Sonia as our background manager to keep me on track here. Yes, important housekeeping tips to bear in mind. This session is being recorded. All mics are muted and video cameras are disabled during the presentation. The questions, if you have any questions, we'll enter them in the question box at the bottom of your screen on the bottom bar, and we will entertain those at the end of the session. If your screen is small and with the talking heads are screens that are bigger, just please drag the presentation screen to the right. That'll enlarge your screen and minimize the heads to the right there. The partner screen will be up again at the end if you wish to capture any of that information. And our presentation will go to about 1:30. So now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Kelly Cooley to bring us invasive plants, the introduction and their impact. Kelly.
All right, thanks, Greg. Greg was nice to me and didn't acknowledge the fact that he and I worked together as ag fieldmen for many years, and I had great respect for Greg. I'm not sure he had the same respect for me, but anyway, we're old colleagues, and it's great to actually work with him briefly on this again. So I'm just going to share my screen so you guys can see my presentation. And if anybody's having issues with that, please just say something in the chat, and we will stop things and make sure we get them looked at. So my thanks to the Forage Associations, Forage and Grazing Associations, the ACA, and Mountain View County for the opportunity to present to you all today. And I'm pleased to hear there were so many signed up for this. That's great. As a farm kid, I know that when the weather's good, people like to be outside and getting work done, and nice that we've had a little bit of moisture. There's some could use a lot more yet, but my farm roots say when the rain comes and the sun shines, people are out there getting work done. So thanks for taking the time to see this presentation today. The reason I put this slide up at the beginning with the land cover of North America is just to reflect the amazing diversity, I guess, of the continent we live on. I'm a local kid at heart in the Pinch Creek area, but my work with invasive species has taken me all across this amazing continent and all its diversity of land cover and land use. You can see everything from forests here, managed and natural forests, areas that we would call badlands or plains, prairie ecosystems, down into tropical and subtropical as you get further south. And I've been privileged with my career to be able to travel to most parts of North America, quite literally from coast to coast to coast in Canada, but also quite a bit around the US and Mexico. And wherever I go, the species are a bit different, but the issues are very similar. And so that's the perspective of taking lessons from a continental perspective and bringing them right back home to the local level. So that's how I approach my work. So most of this is going to be a review for folks on the Zoom call today, but I like to start off with a little bit of terminology. As I said, most of you will be familiar with it. So generally a weed, for example, is a plant growing where it's not wanted or a plant out of place. And because of that broad definition, that can basically be any kind of plant, native, non-native. It can be common or widespread versus threatened or endangered. So just about any plant can be considered a weed. And this is the next one is one that often gets misinterpreted. Noxious weed is actually just a legislative term. It's deemed by some level of government to be harmful to the health of humans, animals, or other parts of the ecosystem. So it's a legislative term. It's not descriptive of poisonous or anything other than just a legislative term. And getting into grazing management, we have plant species that are considered decreasers. So these are rangeland plants specifically that are really desirable, palatable, and productive, and thus wildlife and livestock really like to graze them. And the more grazing pressure you have, the less they tend to persist. They are reduced or decreased in abundance with increased grazing pressure. And as such, they're rarely considered weeds, these species. Usually they're highly prized as native species. So an example down in my part of the world would be rough fescue grass, which is prized as the Alberta provincial grass, and basically the reason why we had colonization and settling here, the grazing for the bison turned into the grazing for the cattle with that species as the keystone grazing species. But it is a decreaser. The heavier you graze, the less of those you get. Increasers, by contrast, are rangeland plants that are less desirable, palatable, and productive, and therefore they're not as readily grazed by wildlife and livestock. So they tend to increase with the less pressure of grazing, and they tend to be more abundant in a heavy grazing pressure type situation. Increasers are often considered weeds, even if they're native species, and quite often I have to, when I'm working with producers, I'll say to them, is it that these increaser species are really bad species or undesirable weeds, or are they just expressing because of the grazing management? And we'll get into that a little bit throughout the talk today. So what about invasive plants? Invasive plants are not only plants growing out of place like a weed definition, but out of their country or region of origin. They're introduced and highly aggressive, and they have the capability of overwhelming native or even tame desirable vegetation because they lack the environmental controls where they were native. So we bring them in to the country, but we don't bring the ecosystem that keeps them in check. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And in rangeland parlance, they call them invaders rather than invasive plants. So you have your increasers, your decreasers, and your invaders. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of, commingling of those terms. And sometimes it's not always clear where the line between, say, an increaser species and an invasive species, an invasive plant are. So I'll talk a little bit more about invasive plants. Again, the diseases, the fungi, the insects or animal feeders, other competitive plants that would keep them in check where they're native are lacked where they're introduced as invaders. And again, lots of impacts: crowding out endangered species, reducing or even eliminating forage value for livestock and wildlife, clogging or drying up waterways, destroying aquatic ecosystems as well as terrestrial, reducing the productive value of both ag and forested land, lowering the value of recreational and agricultural property, harming hunting and fishing potential, and displacing native plants and animals. And again, not to get too deep into the science here, but in a normal native situation, you have those things that keep things in check. And this is just an example of that. The predator-prey dynamic of native species tends to fluctuate not exactly with each other, but they do have population pressure on each other. So when prey species increase, you get a subsequent but definite increase in predator population. And along with other factors, when the predator population gets very high, it does have an impact on the prey species. So these checks and balances are lacking when we have invasive species because some of the pieces of the puzzle are missing. And it's important also to note that invasiveness is not an either or term, it's a relative term. So something might be quite invasive in one area and less invasive in another area, depending on land makeup, land use practices, climate, several other factors. And again, the usually most invasive plants are your deep creeping rooted perennial species, of which we will cover today. But it is a relative term, and it's important to note that it's not just a on and off light switch type of situation. One of my mentors is Dr. Richard Old. He is a retired botanist in Washington State and taught me a lot of what I know about botany in general, and applied botany is what I really like to call it for my type of work. So he's really been influence on my perspective along things. And he had a top 10 defining characteristics of invasive plants. And I won't read the whole thing here, but basically the highlights are that they're opportunistic, they're aggressive and very competitive, highly reproductive, and often in more than one way. They can display rampant growth and spread once they are introduced and adapt to an environment. They're favored by disturbance, just like increaser species tend to be. Highly variable. They have a wide ecological amplitude, which means that they'll adapt to the environment they're in over time. Very mobile, they disperse quite easily, again, often in more than one way. Very persistent and hard to eradicate after they establish. And this is important, they're non-native species. I have seen few examples of truly invasive native plants in my career, no matter where I go. It's almost always more of an increaser species when native ones are behaving in what people perceive to be an invasive manner. Again, it's a real challenge for biodiversity. They tend to form monocultures, the most invasive plants, and they change the whole structure of the habitat for many other species that use those environments. And they can impact both natural native habitat and tame managed areas as well. And this is why we have them. If the coronavirus has taught us anything, the COVID-19 virus that's ravaged the planet is a function of this amazing global transportation system that basically gives us the standard of living and the things we come to expect in life of being able to travel from continent to continent, have goods and services, food, all kinds of things from all over the world. And up until just the last couple of years, this was basically a rampant and constant process, and it's only been reduced somewhat by the pandemic. So this is the reason we've got this great experiment going on and transferring species at a rate that was unheard of for millennia before our generations in the last 100 to 200 years. So talking about what an invasion process looks like versus the check and balance of a native ecosystem, we have these invaders that at the bottom of the S-curve on the left, they are introduced and fly under the radar because people often don't know what they are. And so they get established. If they were controlled at that very early stage, they would be more effectively and inexpensively dealt with before they become a huge problem. But generally speaking, people are not aware of them unless they're trained like you folks are getting today. So people start to become aware of them kind of midway through the S-curve, halfway up the little chart there. And that's when things are already getting to be a little more difficult to manage. You see the control costs on the right go up, as does the area infested over time. And finally, when they achieve their dominance in the landscape, the control costs go way up. The area covered is extensive. There's multiple areas to deal with. and eradication is pretty well impossible. You're only dealing with trying to manage the worst of it. So from a wildfire analogy, the smoke on the horizon is when you want to deal with invasive plants, not when it's a raging wildfire out of control. So part of what we're covering today will be integrated pest management. And this was something that developed in the 1950s and 60s as a response to the incredible widespread adoption of pesticides as a management tool for pests, and particularly with insects. The reasoning behind integrated control, farmers of the day had so widely adopted pesticides as a tool that they were spraying every acre, everything they had, sometimes multiple times a season, which was great from the point of view of the people selling pesticide products. But for the issues regarding non-target organisms being impacted by that widespread spraying, and in a lot of cases, the development of herbicide or pesticide resistance, it led to a conceptual pursuit of something where we remembered some of the other tools we had before we had pesticides. So it was an effort to reduce the dependence and the over-reliance on pesticides. And it was mainly California that did a lot of work on this concept, and the Berkeley and Riverside campuses of the University of California were instrumental in the development of this concept. And it was explicitly defined by the UN, but there's lots of definitions out there, I guess, for integrated management. Some people say it's chemical-free. I disagree with that. I think pesticides are one tool in the integrated manager's toolbox, but not the most important or the only one. And the best definition I've seen out of 67 I found was intelligent pest management. And that's the process by which you don't just say, what do I kill it with? You start to look at your whole system of managing. What are you protecting? What are you doing to prevent pests from being an issue? All the way down to documentation, training yourself, making good records of what you're doing, not relying on the pesticide tool exclusively, and just really thinking of it from a holistic perspective. And so I've come up with my own little cycle, I guess, and this could be viewed almost as a circle rather than a list, but just to go through it quickly, really the first and most important thing is managing for what you want to grow. Then you have to have good preventative techniques. You have to know when you're going to intervene. What is your action threshold? You want to be always aware of and monitoring for identifying and documenting any pests, any weeds that come into your place. And then integrated control measures. We'll talk about the different ways you can use those. Evaluation and documentation after that whole process is very important, and then rinse and repeat. It's a continual process of going through these steps over and over again. So by far the most important concept to remember here before you do anything else about invasive plants is to manage for what you want to grow, not against what you don't want to grow. And I'll let Dallas Mount from the University of Wyoming say a few words about that in the context of cheatgrass or downy brome, which we'll cover as a species later on during this presentation.
Cheatgrass or downy brome is an annual grass that can be a problem in native plant communities or seeded plant communities across the West. We're going to talk about how to graze plant communities that have cheatgrass in them with the objective of controlling, minimizing, or maybe even reducing the amount of cheatgrass in these plant communities. When we're grazing sites with cheatgrass, we need to keep three things in mind. The first is the mindset of managing for what we want, not for managing against what we don't want. And that leads us to point number two. The most important thing is to manage for the health, vigor, and population of the desirable grass species. Here we've got some grass that's bordering this area of cheatgrass. Our management strategies should focus on managing for the health of this desirable perennial species, not against trying to use the cheatgrass during the narrow window that you can graze it. And the third thing is bringing these strategies together with an integrated management approach that may include herbicides or other options for controlling the cheatgrass. But first and foremost, we have to focus on managing for what we want, not against what we don't want. Cheatgrass is an annual grass, meaning it germinates, produces a plant, goes to seed, and dies all within the same year. Cheatgrass generally germinates in the fall of the year and overwinters as a small vegetative plant, and then takes advantage of early spring moisture conditions to make its rapid growth, put on a seed head, and then go dormant for the remainder of the year. Livestock managers often focus their grazing pressure on cheatgrass early in the spring, which is the only time it's really desirable as a livestock feed. That can be okay, but it can also be very dangerous because the animals tend to shift from grazing the cheatgrass to grazing the desirable cool season species very quickly. And if we stay too long, then those animals will actually set back our desirable cool season species. When that cheatgrass plant starts to produce a seed head, it becomes much less desirable to the livestock. So they start grazing these other plants, which are the ones we're trying to encourage to take over this area. So we can actually move that pasture backwards if we're not paying extremely close attention. So we can graze these cheatgrass plants early, but we have to be very diligent. And as soon as those livestock species, as soon as the livestock or grazing animals change their grazing from this cheatgrass to these other desirable cool season perennial species, then we have to remove livestock from that pasture if we want to make some headway managing our cheatgrass problem.
Here's an example where livestock grazing has been allowed to occur for too long into the season. You'll notice some cheatgrass occurring in this pasture. Where are these livestock grazing? Well, they're not grazing the cheatgrass. Seed heads have already been set on the cheatgrass, and you can see it starting to turn color. These livestock are definitely grazing the desirable grasses in this pasture rather than grazing the cheatgrass, and they're causing the problem to get bigger, not reduce. Let's talk about using an integrated approach for control of cheatgrass in pastures. This area was treated with a herbicide to control the cheatgrass and did so very successfully several years ago. However, management was not changed. You'll notice the cheatgrass is back. Without changing the management along with herbicide treatments, you won't solve the problem. Herbicide is simply a Band-Aid. It does not address the underlying problem that causes the cheatgrass to be in the pasture in the first place. You have to fix the underlying problem in order to make headway.
Here's a spot in a pasture that about 3 years ago was almost entirely cheatgrass, but through management for the desirable perennial grasses, in this case, western wheatgrass, we've been able to reduce the population of cheatgrass and improve the population of western wheatgrass. Maybe another 3 to 5 years, the cheatgrass will almost be gone from this, and the western wheatgrass will dominate. An important point, the management focused for what we wanted to see here, the western wheatgrass, rather than focusing against the cheatgrass. No herbicide was used, just grazing at the proper time with the proper amount of animals and leaving the appropriate amount of residual cover was put on this site.
Here's a resource you need to be aware of, the Cheatgrass Management Manual. This is the go-to source for management of cheatgrass in Wyoming and Colorado, and there are sections specifically on grazing management and cheatgrass. I hope this information has been useful. Remember to manage for what you want, not against what you don't want. The health and vigor of those desirable grasses are the key to outcompeting cheatgrass, and using an integrated management approach will be key to your success against cheatgrass. From the University of Wyoming Extension, I'm Dallas Mount.
Okay, so again, the last bit of that video showed him standing in that western wheatgrass that had been recovered strictly from grazing management changes. And you did notice there was some other weeds in there. Those were flicksweed, which would be easily handled by a broadleaf herbicide. But it's a lot easier to take flicksweed out of western wheatgrass than it is to take downy brome out of western wheatgrass using a herbicide. So again, it's using that management principle. And I don't know how many times across North America I've seen similar situations to what Dallas outlines there, where people try all kinds of different chemistries, but they don't change that underlying grazing management regime. And again, they get great kills in the short term, but the weeds come roaring back because the grazing management isn't being looked at appropriately. So I like to look at the rest of the process of integrated management as like a 4-season pizza. It's a cycle, it's a circle, and you have prevention, you have early detection, rapid response, you have integrated management techniques, and monitoring, evaluation, and reclamation. But again, for managing for what you want, not against what you don't, the pizza itself has to be using quality ingredients and has to be prepared properly, or the rest of the process doesn't work at all. So it's very important to do managing for what you're trying to grow, what you're trying to protect. So the next stage is prevention, managing in such a manner to prevent invasive species or invasive plants from becoming a threat. That's the most cost-effective and very efficient way to deal with a weed issue for sure. So lots of different ways you can prevent species, becoming familiar with them, educating yourself and anyone else that uses your property or the public lands if you're in that situation. Sourcing weed-free seed, forage, and gravel materials, cleaning your equipment in and out of your properties to reduce the spread of species from one pasture to another, from one location to another. Managing routine disturbances, whether that's salt lick places, watering areas. These disturbances are opportunities for increaser species and invaders to get a foothold and spread out from there. So it's very important to manage them and use clean sources and equipment when you do. Comprehensive inspection and monitoring, just always being on the lookout. And we'll talk about a few of those in more detail. One of the projects I'm involved with that's a continental message is this concept of play clean go and work clean go. And that's basically all about stopping invasive species in your tracks. And that can be everything from your boots to your pets to your horses to your equipment you use. Keeping them clean will reduce the chance of infection from one place to another and make it so you don't have to spend a lot of money on controls. So I have a quick video here that talks about managing Western rangelands and specifically with regards to ATV equipment, which I know many of you use in your operation.
That I have of living out here in these wildlands, this openness and the beauty of a place like this, these contiguous tracts of land, these landscapes, these watersheds that have been this way for thousands of years. They're systems and they work, and they're chaotic, but they work, and we're a part of it, but we have to remain vigilant about how we interact with it. You know, we use four-wheelers for work, but there's been a huge surge in the amount of people that come out onto these surrounding public lands to tour and recreate on four-wheelers. Keeping your gear clean will just help provide an ethic not only for now but for the future public lands and private lands. Wash off the front of your vehicle and your radiator where tall grasses and tall weeds might embed their seeds, and under the front side, and just kind of spray underneath. And it's really that simple. You can stop through the car wash and spray it off. There's no reason not to clean your gear. Play, clean, go.
I'd like to thank my friends from the Wyoming Weed and Pest Council who produced that video. There are again some people that I really look up to with their forward-thinking progressive programs in Wyoming. Great state and great place where they do use these principles. So the next stage in integrated management is basically setting your time you're going to intervene, and that's when your invasive plant populations are hopefully before they're causing you trouble. And if they're legislated species, noxious or prohibited noxious weeds, then that's an earlier intervention where you do it right off when you see even one species, for example, for prohibited noxious species under Alberta's weed legislation. Next stage in the process is monitoring for, identifying, and documenting weed species, invasive species, and noxious, prohibited noxious weeds. So you should know and understand their life cycles. Know them from all growth stages, not just when they're in flower. Anybody can be a weed expert when things are in flower. This becomes important so you know which suite of integrated controls you're going to prepare or apply for the species you're dealing with. And how do you get more familiar with these? Well, you're doing it today. The Alberta Invasive Species Council, Canadian Council on Invasive Species are good resources. Wheatland County has produced an excellent guide that now I think has been taken up by the Alberta Invasive Species Council, and it has all the provincial weeds on the legislated list. Then this concept of early detection and rapid response, if you think back to the S curve I showed earlier, you want to get hitting these plants early enough in their introduction to the environment you're working in so that they don't take off and become just a huge, huge, expensive and very hard to manage problem. So you have to learn to recognize these things, again, at all growth stages, and intervene, and also share that information with your neighbors. You know, we've got some new weeds here. Make sure they know that they're in the territory so that you can work together on them, and not just, some people with especially legislated species tend to want to hide that fact. No, you want to work with your neighbors, work with the county, work with anybody that will help you to manage them, because they're not easy to manage. So you want to learn to recognize a species like knapweed at this stage of growth when it's just a small issue, rather than waiting until you've got a situation like this, which is just south of Cardston in Montana, in Babb area of Montana, northwest Montana, where, you know, everything you see in that photograph is spotted knapweed. That's a problem that's going to be expensive, if not impossible, to eradicate. So life cycles are super important, and I'll run through those as part of the presentation today as we go through different species. It's important to know what the life cycles are. So that helps you to prepare, as I said before, the suite of controls you might employ on them. So in talking about those different controls, there's lots of things to consider when you're choosing method or methods, and a lot of times you're going to use things in conjunction with each other during different timing. So environmental conditions, the cost of the pest versus the cost of the control, the impacts of the pest versus the controls you might use, if it's herbicides or some other. How effectiveness do you expect the control to be? And how safe is it going to be for yourself and anyone else that might use that site if you're going to be using different controls? So lots of different things out there. Pesticide is one that always gets looked at, you know, the what do I kill it with approach. But mowing or cutting, biological controls, either insects or fungi or other biota, species to graze, sheep, goats, and cattle. You're going to hear about that next week from Kathy. Multi-species grazing is sometimes employed. Mechanical pulling, hand pulling, cultivation, fire, smothering, and fertilization. There's lots of different tools in the toolbox for you to employ. And it's choosing the right ones at the right times in the right duration with the right intensity. It's really quite a process, but if you're doing your research and consulting those who've had experience in the system you're managing and the species you're trying to control, then you'll have more success. So tillage is obviously something that is a bit of an issue with regards to erosion potential by wind and water. But for certain annual species, it can be something that can work quite well, and in certain situations. Obviously, in a grazing rangeland situation, it's not your best tool, but it is something that is there for small infestations that you're trying to keep from becoming a bigger problem. This organic producer in the Pinch Creek area doesn't use herbicides or fertilizers in his operation. And so he employs summer students, often from overseas when we're not in pandemic. And he has a couple of pastures that he takes his winter manure and straw bedding from his winter bedding down operation and feeding operation, and he spreads it on his pastures to improve the organic health and tilth and you know, general condition of his pastures. So this is an example of that here. These pastures are quite historically heavily infested with a couple creeping rooted species. Common toadflax or yellow toadflax and leafy spurge, two of the worst actually. And through a process of, again, improving the health, managing his grazing carefully, and then using a smothering technique using tarps and his summer students with a whippersnipper to go around and make sure that these things don't have their heads above ground, he's been very successful at keeping his weed problems at bay. There still is leafy spurge and common toadflax in this pasture, but you have to hunt to find them because he's so vigilant and you know, with his fairly inexpensive labor that he uses, the room and board situation of a summer student on exchange, he's able to keep it where he has very productive pastures and just never can let the pressure up on the species he's controlling. So a combination of smothering or tarping with to deal with the biggest part of the patches, and then whippersnipping around the edges of those tarp to keep anything from spreading out from there. Here's an example of that. See some common toadflax on the left and some leafy spurge on the right, and just a small section of tarp. He's got some much larger ones that he lays down for big patches. Hand pulling can work. These are both biennial species, blueweed on the left and my self-folding Dames rocket on the right. At this stage of the game, they're in flower, and this is probably one of the best things you can do is to dig, make sure you get the root if you can, and remove those flowering plants and don't let them go to seed. If you were to drop either of these species at this stage, they can still actually use what energy is left in their plant material to go to seed. So again, what you'd want to do if you couldn't get the root in these situations is to make sure that you're not letting those flowers grow. On the left is also oxeye daisy, which is a creeping rooted perennial. Hand pulling is not as an effective strategy on any kind of size with regards to a creeping rooted perennial, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, if you do use hand pulling as an option, many hands make light work, and we've seen various successful projects where you take 4-H clubs or local service groups and put them to work on an issue that you're having trouble managing yourself. And you know, you can reduce the persistence of some large populations by putting many people to work either on a voluntary or paid basis. Fire can be used both as a landscape tool and as a way of dealing with plants that are in seed, like in the case of this burdock here, which we'll look at more detail in a minute. And obviously mowing or cutting, grazing, which I won't get into in depth because Kathy's going to cover that next week. That is part of the picture. And sometimes you're going to be using, especially things like grazing, cutting, in combination with a follow-up herbicide application in order to get control of biennial and perennial species. When you're using herbicides, you can use big boom applications if that's the most productive. But if you're trying to minimize your impacts on what's desirable, what you're managing for what you want, maybe you want to take more of a targeted approach with smaller application equipment. And keep that in mind that it's not always go big or go home. Sometimes a more surgical approach is the better one. And again, here's an example of a piece of equipment that combines two methods. It combines mowing with a wicking system. These are called a wet blade or sometimes called a one-pass system. And the herbicide goes down to the hub of the blades that are cutting and wicks with the spinning of the blades along the cutting surface of the blades and injects itself into the invasives that you're dealing with. And we've seen that work very successfully on both Canada thistle and leafy spurge, which I'll talk about a little later. You really want to focus your integrated control efforts on all these areas of potential disturbance. So approaches, storage areas, waste areas, your hay storage places, your feeding spots, your watering, salting areas, fence lines and headlands, little trails that either you leave or animals leave, bridges and intersections, culvert areas, on and on and on. Those are all areas where invasives get a foothold and form a little nursery that they try to spread out from there. Finally, with integrated management, you want to consider all the things you were thinking about before and evaluate how well everything worked. So did we meet expectations of what we were trying to do? Are the things we want to grow doing better? And are we reducing the populations of what we don't want? So there's the review of integrated management from my perspective. Again, I think this recording will be available. So if something got lost in the detail, you can go back and take a look at the steps as they're outlined here. So let's take a look at a few species. First, we're going to look at summer annual species. So these are ones that germinate from seed in the spring and through the course of the growing season, establish a taproot and then basically put their flowers up and go to seed all in the same calendar year, generally from spring to fall. And so from the herbicide point of view, the best time to control a summer annual is as early in this process as possible. You use less product, you have less of a root system to contend with, you have little chance of flowers going to seed, and it's all around a better experience. So one that we're going to look at here is scentless chamomile. This species can be a summer annual, winter annual, biennial, or perennial. So it's a bit of an outlier, but I have seen it quite often behave as an annual species, so that's one I chose today. Very distinctive flower in some ways, that classic daisy flower, but it's actually quite similar to oxeye daisy. What you see with scentless chamomile though is once the flowers are a little more mature, the petals tend to fold down, which I don't see as much with oxeye daisy. So that's one little diagnostic characteristic. Very finely divided leaves on this plant. If you're not familiar with it, anybody from Central North probably is, but in the South it's less common. And very branched, can get quite tall, but also can grow fairly short to the ground, and likes to move with equipment, soil, gravel, hay. It's very adaptable in how it transports itself around the countryside. This was a place up in the special areas where they had a huge issue with scentless chamomile that was spreading in a hay crop, and then the producer in question was actually spreading it around the countryside by feeding the bales that he harvested off this. And as you can see there, it actually is supposed to be a hay crop. He has some other issues in that crop as well. And for a weed person like me, this is about as disgusting a scene as you can possibly see. So this was where I felt a little bit overwhelmed by the mess that this producer was dealing with. This plant is also spread through garden centers. Quite often it comes along either as a something they're actually selling or as a stowaway in some of the, I guess, less educated garden centers that I've seen. This one was near Lethbridge. But this is where you're going to get ahead of scentless chamomile. You don't want to wait for those flowers. You want to hit it when it's at its smallest point, because then it's just trying to build a little root, and you get a lot more bang for your herbicide buck. When it comes to more mature plants as they go along, this is still probably something that I would recommend herbicides for as it starts to regrow. Even here, I would probably lean against going with herbicides in this case, and I would pull and bag those plants and deal with them that way. And again, this is early detection rapid response at this site. That plant to the right can actually produce up to 500,000 seeds. So something you don't want to have go to seed on a property if it's a new invader. And hand pulling is a big tool with this. You can cut it, but because it can regrow from that root, as most annuals don't, but this one can, you want to make sure you go back and don't have any regrowth with this. So basically, for small infestations, hand pull, bag, and burn. There's many broadleaf sprays registered for chamomile, but you want to get after it as much as possible at the seedling stage. If you're doing anything else, you want to make sure you're not giving that opportunity to go to seed. And pulling these plants in flower, you have to make sure you bag them, because they will actually go to seed with what's remaining of the foliage. So if you can't do that and you have to use mowing or cutting, cut from the top down on an annual species so that you basically ruin the flowering system as much as possible without leaving any attached plant material to try and make those seeds viable before the plant dies. I don't know with grazing management on these species, but I'm sure Kathy will answer the question if she's had experience with regards to grazing chamomile. Next one we'll look at is downy brome or cheatgrass, which Dallas talked about in the video. This was a plant that was first introduced in 1898 in Washington State. And you see the basic tendency of it here for those that are not familiar with downy brome. And again, this drooping heads and that red coloration on maturity. This is actually a winter annual species, so it germinates in the fall of the first year and then regrows, and generally is gone to seed by early June, which makes it a little different from the summer annuals, which tend to seed out in the end of the summer. So it's very, very important to get after these ones earlier. This plant can actually really reduce the productive grass yield on ground, as Dallas was talking about. It also increases the frequency of fire on the landscape, and it's quite adapted to fire. And so a lot of the Western rangelands have been really highly impacted by this species, which again didn't exist on the continent much prior to 1900. Huge costs in control, total ecosystem transformer, and it is moving very readily in Canada as well, in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan particularly. So this is one that if you don't have it or you have it in small numbers, you want to get after it and keep it that way. For something that just arrived in 1898, we now have 100 million acres of this plant in the Western United States and Canada. So that's a lot of weeds since 1898. And this is what it can do. It transforms the landscape, makes it so shrubs and trees burn up in the frequent fires, and it tends to do very well, and then it doesn't hold the soil, and you get big erosion events as well in some of these shrubby treeland areas. So a real problem species. You can actually do some good very, very early in Alberta, February, March, to use glyphosate before the cool season grasses emerge. But you also can use, as Dallas mentioned, grazing management and doing it before the seed heads form. They will actually eat this species. Cattle or other species will eat it. And basically, once you've got a seed head, spraying becomes something you're not going to win with. You're not going to win it with grazing, mowing, or anything else. You can do some hand pulling on small infestations, and you can burn seed heads as they did here in Water Lakes National Park because on this slope, the cheatgrass got away from them, got a little too far advanced, and they're trying to minimize seed production. The plant will die anyway, as you recall with the winter annual, so it's not as critical to kill the plant, but it is critical to reduce the seed load with the hanging seeds. So that's the only way you're dealing with it with fire, because it's very adapted to fire otherwise. So without further management change at this site, for example, you're just going to get continued reinfestation of downy brome. There is a new product called Esplanade that Bayer has put out. I'm not advertising, but it is a fall applied soil active product. So it doesn't kill existing downy brome. It actually gets them as they germinate, both in the fall and in the spring. And that has some promise. There's several counties are doing trials on it. And we're hopeful that it is something adding to the arsenal of tools against this really troubling species. There's also a bio herbicide that's been registered just recently as of in the US in September of 2020. And we're hopeful that is another thing that will come to Canada to help us in our battle with this species. Moving on to biennial species, these ones germinate in the first year in the spring by seed. And the first year there is no flowering that occurs. It's all about building a taproot. So you don't see any flowers with biennial species. After the first winter, the taproot survives, the top dies back. And the next spring from the taproot, you get regeneration of a bolting plant, much larger plant than leaves you see in the first year. And through the course of that second growing season, it will send up largely branched and multi-flowered parts and set seed in the fall of the second year. So generally speaking, with biennial species, you want to focus your herbicide efforts in the first year, not in the second year. The first year is when that species is building a taproot, and that will be the way you can control that plant without any risk of things going to seed. If you're doing herbicide application in the second year, or frankly, grazing or hand pulling or cutting, what you're doing with the taproot sending out all its energy to make flowers and eventually seeds is you're giving that plant a haircut. It will do everything it possibly can to regenerate from any disturbance on top in order to fulfill its life cycle in the second year, which is to set seed. So you have to be really careful with your management choices in the second year that you're not, you might twist it up with herbicide, for example, in the spring of the second year, and it'll look really great. But if you go back, it tends to regrow. Same thing with if you don't get enough of the root with pulling them or mowing them, it will tend to regrow at a shorter height with a lot of flowers and eventually seeds in that second year. That's not an issue in the first year. That's why I recommend herbicides be applied in the first year for biennial species. And common burdock is the one that I'll use as an example here. It is a taprooted biennial. And here's where you make your gains. Right here is showing a bunch of seedling burdock. So most people know burdock by the giant, 6 to 8 foot tall, messy plant with burrs all over it, big leaves. Now, this is the same species, it's just in its early infancy. And again, it's a lot cheaper and a lot more effective to control burdock at this stage than waiting for its second year growth. So I highly, highly recommend that you use that tool. Where to look for it? Well, anywhere where animals rub or bed down, you're going to find little nurseries of common burdock. And here's an example of that in the Pincher Creek Valley, where I'm from. Deer were the ones that deposited this little site. They would have bedded down there for shelter from the storm or just to sleep overnight. And they rubbed off all their burrs, they broke open and made a nice little colony of burdock. So here's a second year burdock that's regrowing from the taproot. You notice the leaves are quite different, more rhubarb-like. And it hasn't quite sent up the big stems yet, but this is definitely a second year plant that's starting to bolt. Again, the leaves of these are big and wide for effective photosynthesis, and the roots you see with the stems here very similar to rhubarb in a lot of ways. And eventually these things send up their big stalks with the capsules that everybody calls burrs. And you see actually the hooks there in the picture on the right. The fellow who invented Velcro got his idea from this plant. And a little closer view of that. These are just capsules that carry between 15 and 25 seeds in every one. And they're the reason that this plant spreads around. These things hook onto the fur of animals, into equipment, and get moved around the countryside and rubbed off later. So what we like to call a porcupine egg, the burrs are just a capsule and a transport mechanism. And this is, anyone with livestock who's had to deal with burdock knows the irritation this can cause for the producer and for the livestock. And they can get large. I'm standing at eye level here looking up at a big patch of burdock. And again, a lot of ranchers I know will go after these with spraying. And at this stage of the game, this is a senior citizen patch you're looking at. These things are already going to die at the end of the season very shortly from this point. And you're better off harvesting those in a different way than using herbicide, because you're not going to win with that as an approach. This is a 3rd year or beyond burdock, and this is, again, a control time that you can use, like we did here on the Old Man River, where we harvested those to start our integrated approach, and harvested everything that had capsules on it, had burrs on it. Not a very fun job, but we did have a fairly good-sized crew, and used fire to dispose of all the seed potential that was there. Here's a shot of the site before we worked on it. What we did here was remove the plants that had the seeds on them, and then followed up later in the season with a herbicide spray, a broadleaf herbicide spray that would leave the grasses behind but take out the broadleaf seedling burdock. And 3 years of that approach, we ended up with a very clean landscape. So this is integrated approach in action. Winter months are an unappreciated time, both for dealing with plants in seed, with seed in their capsules, and also to map your sites for follow-up spraying of first-year plants in the next year. So there can be nice little flags where you can bring your phone and GPS the sites for follow-up the following season. Doesn't take much in terms of broadleaf available products with burdock. Very easy to control the first-year plants with spray. And again, I've kind of described the rest. I don't recommend grazing this species because of the risk of spreading seed capsules around, the burrs around. Kathy may have a different opinion of that, and I respect that. She may have had success with it, but you definitely want to do it with areas that don't have active burrs present, I would say. Wild caraway is another biennial. This is one that's not regulated everywhere in Alberta because it is a spice crop. Again, very distinctive flowers on this one. It's in the parsley family or carrot family, so it has that distinctive umbel-like top, like an umbrella upside down. And the flowers are quite showy, but otherwise it's a very inconspicuous plant. It can fly under the radar prior to having this on it. So the flowers are very distinctive. The foliage is very finely divided on this, so somewhat similar to scentless chamomile, but when you see them side by side, they're quite different. And this is, again, a highly valued spice crop. So Alberta Agriculture is hesitant to put it on the provincial weed list, but many municipalities in the western section of Alberta have elevated it to noxious status because it is moving in hay crops, it is moving along water courses, and it seems to be spread by birds as well. So it's been quite a problem along the eastern slopes of the Rockies and into the foothills, and even a little further east from that. So I say broadleaf herbicides again on first-year plants with wild caraway. Don't let those second-year plants get the seed heads on them. If you can mow them down or graze them or use something to suppress their growth so they don't make those flowers, then you can eventually get ahead of it over time if you're not producing a seed from year to year to year. And again, biennials die after the second year anyway, so be aware of where they're at in the process. Moving on to simple perennials, these are similar to biennials in that they use a taproot to regrow from, but the difference is they go year after year from that taproot. And the dandelion is the best example. I recommend actually with simple perennials to do your treatments on the plants in the fall. And that's because that's when they're taking down energy into their root systems for winter storage. In the spring, I find perennials are quite resistant to spray. You might twist them up, but particularly with something like a dandelion, they tend to twist up the leaves, but they go to seed anyway. So I recommend fall treatment with herbicides. And with most perennial species, I suggest mowing through the growing season to both stress the root and also to limit the amount of flowers and seeds that you would have coming back. So white cockle is a taprooted biennial. Big problem in hay crops. It's in the pink family, so you've got leaves at the nodes on the stem that are equal and opposite, and they go across from each other on the stem, and you get these little football-like seed heads on them. This is a good example in special areas where they've spread their problem in their hay yard out to their pastures, and they have many, many things to deal with. So this is, again, waiting a little too long in that S-curve to deal with it. So just a few more shots of it. Again, showing the classic pink family, equal and opposite leaves, and the quite distinctive family trait of the seed heads with the flowers on top of the capsule. And here's what it looks like when it is in seed. So again, prior to flowering, you can use these chemistries on white cockle in rangeland and pasture. I would really recommend frequent mowing to prevent flowering and wear out those perennial taproots. If you have small patches, try and dig them out. They are a taproot rather than a creeping root, so you've got some thing to go on there. Bag and dispose or burn those things that you do hand pull. Always checking for regrowth throughout the season, and really watch for spread in hay. And grazing management, again, I have little experience with grazing this species, but that might be a good question to ask Kathy next week. Absinthe wormwood is another example. And again, for time, I won't go through all the details, but this is an unregulated species in Alberta because it is so widespread. Some jurisdictions have elevated it to noxious status, but this perennial taproot species is already pretty widespread in the province. Again, a non-native invader that's done very, very well, and we've waited a little too long to try and get after. So again, the smaller the stage, the better off you are, but I still recommend mowing, grazing, or cutting this species through the growing season to stress the root and prevent flowering and seed production. And then following up on the regrowth in the fall with regards to your herbicide application. This is an example of what it does. It's quite unpalatable to most livestock. Again, Kathy would maybe say that you could train them to eat this. I haven't got experience with that, but she can talk to you about that next week. But you see that animals generally graze around this species, and you get these kinds of situations where the only things growing are the absinthe wormwood. And because of its popularity as a herbal product, it's spread right across North America. As far as different chemistries that do well on it, it's actually surprising how many do well on it. Milestone works extremely well. Grazon is quite effective on it. And there is, in terms of the integrated management approaches, they don't recommend in most literature I've seen the grazing option, but again, I'll defer to Kathy on that. Prescribed burning, yeah, most times with this type of approach, I've seen more problems associated with it. They say you can till it, but that's not very effective in a rangeland situation. And then mostly grubbing, digging, or hand pulling on small infestations. Other than that, you see the chemistries listed there. There are several that are quite effective and fairly readily available. So it's all about timing and using other tools like grazing and whatnot to stress that plant and then hit it when it's translocating in the fall. Should it be designated noxious? Well, I don't think so because of the fact it's so widespread. Finally, we're going to deal with creeping perennials, and just a couple examples of that here. Creeping perennials have year after year regeneration, not only from seed, but from the creeping roots. And again, in general, with the species, other creeping perennials, I like to see mowing or cutting or grazing through the growing season to prevent flowering, and fall application of broadleaf herbicides in order to get ahead of it. So Canada thistle is an interesting creeping perennial. About 95% of this plant is in its root system underground. So what we see above ground is very little of the plant. This was originated in the continent about in the 1600s, and lots of different common names for it. but massive, massive root systems. It's hard to describe how large these systems are and how quickly they spread. So even a wildfire like we've had here in the West, one of the first species to recover from wildfire regenerating from the creeping roots is Canada thistle. Does very, very well. And again, like this picture shows, what you see on top is just a tiny bit of it. It's just the tip of the iceberg. 1/2 inch of horizontal creeping root is all it takes to generate a new shoot of Canada thistle. And it can grow 200 meters or 1/8 of a mile, a 1/2 inch chunk of Canada thistle root in just 6 months. So a tremendous plant, amazing root systems, and really a lot of impact, whether it's in a cropland situation or in a rangeland. So again, it's really understanding the life cycle. Canada thistle tends to actually wait until the warmer periods. It's all going to jump out of the ground in the next week here, if it's not out already. But May, June, and July is all about growing taller and producing a flower. So you want to actually, in this case with Canada thistle, even wait just right until bud stage and then cut it off at the ground level. And your regrowth will actually usually not have any flowers or seeds on it. It will grow short to the ground as little rosettes. And again, leaving that until the fall, when that plant system will use the photosynthesis energy and the resources in the soil to rebuild that root for winter storage, that's when you want to apply your broadleaf herbicides with Canada thistle. So the old people actually knew this. The old timers used a scythe on this right just before the hay was cut kind of time. And if you want to go that way, you can still do it. There are scythes available for small infestations. And there are biocontrols that are out there, but they're not at the commercial viability stage quite yet. So again, I would say if you're spraying in the spring or early summer, you're going to suppress it. You're going to have less luck actually eradicating it. So I would say wait on your herbicide applications, use the mowing grazing technique during the growing season and hit them in the fall. Oxeye daisy, another creeping perennial. Very similar management. Again, when you've got a situation like the bottom right, you know you're in trouble. You want to get it when they're small infestations. Here's a good slide that shows the differences between oxeye daisy in the foreground and scentless chamomile in the background. And recognizing these at these the early stage of growth before they get a flower is very important in choosing your management. And again, you want to get it when it's just a couple plants like on the left, rather than like you have in Fernie and a lot of parts of the eastern slopes of the Rockies here in Alberta, where things have already gotten out of control. So spraying through the growing season on any kind of seedlings for oxeye daisy, broadleaf sprays, many are registered for oxeye daisy. If you've got small infestations, you can dig and bag them, but generally speaking, I would recommend more of a grazing approach or tillage if you can. But in my experience, that can tend to be counterproductive. You make more disturbance, you end up with more weeds, and it's a tough proposition. So the best thing to do is to try and manage over a period of years, focusing on seedlings before they get a flower. If you do have flowering situations, those are good areas to map, and then you can get ahead of it. Again, Kathy may have had experience next week that she can tell you about grazing oxeye daisy successfully, but I've only seen success with this when you use basically a multi-year approach of keeping it from flowering however possible, and then treating throughout the growing season on the seedling plants that don't have flowers. So that's my recommendation on oxeye daisy. Similarly, again, creeping perennial of tall buttercup. This is one that very much favors a wet area. It's not as extensive a creeping root system as, here I'm told my time is up already. Try and get through the rest here. This one really likes to have its feet wet or its roots wet. And so it can be a challenge to get in on this before it flowers because of that fact. This likes moist wet meadows. And often you can actually find underground water courses by the pattern of growth of this plant. It's quite inconspicuous before it gets the flower on it, kind of a thin plant with leaves that are sort of fly under the radar in a lot of cases. Once it gets its flower with a little shiny buttercup on top, it's quite readily apparent that you have an issue. And again, this is less of a problem in the eastern part of the prairies as it is in the foothills and mountain regions, and even in southeast Alberta and the Cypress Hills, they have a big problem with this. Lots of herbicide registered for tall buttercup, but even MCPA will work well on it in old chemistry. And again, if you can try to mow it to the ground as much as possible, and possibly using sheep or goats, as long as you don't have wild sheep or goats present, that can be a strategy. But you want to follow that as the season dries out, you know, and you're able to get back on it. Get rid of those flowers if you can in advance, and then you do your herbicide application. And over the course of several seasons in a big infestation, you can reduce your tall buttercup. I feature both toad flaxes here. This is first Dalmatian toad flax, and its cousin common toad flax will be coming. These are both noxious species, creeping rooted perennials. And a lot of times people miss these before they get the flower, but this is what the little foliage of Dalmatian toad flax looks like. And you can actually see last year's plants sticking up higher from them, proving that this is a perennial species. So again, an infestation of this size, you may even use hand pulling or mowing from the top down to obliterate the flowers, and then wait until you get to the fall to treat. And in a situation like this, you'd have to try and reduce the seed with mowing as much as possible, or targeted grazing, because at this stage you're not doing early detection rapid response. So fall spraying on regrowth, or spring spraying if that's your only option, and you can get ahead of it. There is biological control for this species, and quite successful actually. Messinus janthinus is the agent involved, and it does quite well both at the larval stage and the early stages in the roots and shoots of the plant. So it's been quite successful at taking land that's quite heavily infested with Dalmatian toad flax and reducing it through that biological control means. Yellow toad flax is one that maybe central Alberta and northern Alberta are more familiar with. We do have it along the eastern slopes in southwest Alberta as well. And again, this is a little different foliage on this plant, but very similar flower. It again spreads very readily in most soils and most land uses, from crops to rangeland to disturbed areas with these creeping rooted systems. And it may or may not flower. Each one of the shoots that comes off that creeping root doesn't necessarily flower. Some do and some don't, and some are just there for photosynthesis. So hand pulling of this species is not really recommended, as for Dalmatian, once you get outside a small patch, just because you're dealing with a creeping root system. So, you know, targeted grazing or a mowing program, if that's practical, is probably your best bet, followed by a fall application of broadleaf herbicides. And there are several registered. I've seen best success on both species with the herbicides listed here. Most other herbicides will only suppress it, so you could use that if your grazing or cutting were not viable options. You could use many broadleaf herbicides to suppress this set of plants. If you have a bare ground situation, you can use non-selectives like Amitrol or glyphosate. Amitrol is getting a little harder to get now. And again, I'd be curious next week to see what success Kathy has had with grazing both the species of toad flax. Finally, in terms of the invaders, leafy spurge is the last one I'll cover. This is one that, again, is not native to North America, but tends to do very well in similar latitudes on our side. So it is a native plant in Eurasia. It's a really dominant perennial, probably the worst of the ones I've featured, and nearly 500,000 acres in 35 states and all Canadian provinces. So it's done very, very well since coming to North America in 1827. It can withstand flooding. Seeds can remain viable for 8 years, and 1/2 inch of root fragment can regenerate the plant. So again, it's a very, very difficult plant, huge irritant for most species of cattle. And sheep and goats can be trained to tolerate it, but it is a tough one, and cattle generally won't graze it unless they're trained. 80% cover of leafy spurge reduces the carrying capacity of rangeland to 0. So it's a very, very impactful species. Does very well in southern Alberta, not as prevalent in central northern parts of the province, thankfully, but we've got huge issues with it. And this is the reason it's such a problem. The buds on the root all form shoots. You see these when there's a cut bank on a riparian area on a stream or river system. See all the little creeping root systems, and some are flowering, some are not. Here's a shot from Wyoming of what they do in a creek or river system. So if you don't have leafy spurge right now, you want to keep it that way. There is some successful biological control on leafy spurge. These two beetles have been imported from where the plant is native, and they feed exclusively on leafy spurge, so it makes them a very effective biocontrol. This is a shot I took of the black dot spurge beetle, and it does its work again in the roots and shoots through the growing season, even in the winter months. And in the summer, when they emerge as adults, that's when you see the top foliage feeding, and that's when we collect them to actually spread to other sites. So here's an example in Pincher Creek of a site that we used no herbicide on. We just released the insects in 2006, and in 3 years, we had our problem licked. That's a best case scenario. That's not generally going to happen, but it is something that can be effective if your insects overwinter and do very well. There is a hawk moth that is found that does do some impact on the foliage of leafy spurge, but they don't reproduce in numbers enough to have a real effect. So this is what the moth of that caterpillar looks like, and they're huge, about the size of your finger. So they're quite an impressive looking insect, but they don't do great work on it. I mentioned this before, using the system to smother this plant. Leafy spurge can be effectively done this way if you're not using herbicides, and then using the whippersnipper approach, as I mentioned earlier. As far as creeping perennials, fall applications are a really important piece of the picture. Trying to remove the top growth during the growing season if you can, and then focusing your efforts in the fall. Even though leafy spurge turns to a reddish color in the fall prior to killing frost, it still takes up herbicide very readily. And that's something that a lot of people miss. They think the plant on the right is actually already dead, but it's not. It's just changed color as the leaves on a perennial tree do. And fall application can be very effective. It's less hard on your grasses that you want to grow. And this example in Cardston shows what a selective spray can do on some stuff that's been mowed through the growing season, and they're spraying the regrowth. So that's my recommendation. We have, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, used this wet blade or one pass system, combining herbicides with a cutting system, and that has proven to work fairly well, particularly with Tordon 22K. The only problem we had with it is wheel tracks. We found that the cutting system missed the wheel tracks on the sites we've had, but we had 3 years of effective control using Tordon 22K on the areas where there weren't wheel tracks. So it was quite a successful trial that we did then back in 2009. There are several species that suppress leafy spurge, but very few that control it. Tordon 22K is the most effective. I have heard some good things with some of these other products, but mostly as suppression. So again, hand pulling is not your option here. You can do some good with grazing. There's been some very successful projects, especially with sheep and goats, on grazing leafy spurge. Cattle, again, I'll defer to Kathy on that for next week. And Waldron Grazing Co-op in Southwest Alberta has had some success with both insects and sheep. So they use them in the lowlands and herbicides on the top lands. And this is a shot from Karma Tyberg of Ag Canada, where she documented the work that the sheep and the insects did in 2005 to 2009. Now, my only caution here is the grazing pressure here is from both sheep in the spring, but they also follow it with cattle. And I'm not opposed to what Mike Roberts has done as the manager there for Waldron Grazing Co-op. He does great work. I just worry a little bit if people don't have the experience that they could have issues with overgrazing. And again, it has to be done with great caution and great management care. And you also have to deal with things like shepherding and predation, which again necessitates good shepherding. So you have to have people that know what they're doing with that and are patient enough to deal with it. So Mike Roberts from Waldron Grazing Co-op is a producer I'd recommend you talking to. Has great experience with this species in particular, but using sheep and insects as management tools as well. Finally, just to finish off my talk, I've got 2 species Greg asked me to do that I would consider not invaders, but increaser species. The wild rose perennial shrub which flowers in June and August. This is Alberta's provincial flower. And again, not a non-native invader. This is a native species that tends to do really well with an underlying issue with grazing. So it's voided by livestock and wildlife, and tends to do well when the grazing pressure gets heavy. Similar issue with the perennial herb woodland or wild strawberry, another native species that is an increaser and grows not only from creeping roots but also from stolons above ground, and does very, very well in some of the pastures, woodland areas that you guys are growing or are using for your pastures. I would say with this, you could use sound grazing management as a really effective tool. You could target them perhaps with sheep and goats, and various herbicides work quite well on it. But again, I'll go back to what I said before, manage for what you want, not against what you don't. You can do some spot work on wild rose and woodland strawberry, but if you're not changing that underlying management of your grazing, you're going to continue to have issues with these species. So use these herbicides, but don't just use them alone as your tool with this particular couple species. I'd like to thank all the people and organizations you see listed here. They've helped me along my way, and some of the information you've seen today is because of their influence and camaraderie and networking that I've done with them all over North America, and I'm thankful for their expertise that I draw upon. Just a quote from my mentor I mentioned earlier, Richard Old: "Remember, when dealing with invasive plants, your failures are obvious. People can see where you've missed, but your successes where you've been successful are invisible. You won't see them anymore." So that's wrapping it up. I'm a little late, Greg. Too many slides, I guess, but lots of things to cover there. So I'll take any questions.
Not to worry at all, Kelly. I'd just like to thank Kelly for sharing your knowledge and expertise and your perspectives, and a lot of your experiences with invasive species and how we can understand their impact and some of their management. I was just looking at our question box, and we didn't have any questions, and sometimes that's because, like myself, I think we're enthralled with your presentation, a lot of information, and I think they answered a lot of questions that came into my mind. But without any questions, what I would like to do is touch base on a couple key things that really resonated with this presentation. And you kind of finalized it just best, and I actually marked it down. I got it on a sticky note that's going to sit on my desk now, is manage for what you want and not against what you don't want. And I think that is particularly a good guiding principle for all of it. And one of the things that really resonated with me as well in dealing with invasive species, and especially the prevention side of it, and that's part of my ag fieldman heritage, I guess, is being a real hawk on weed-free seed and forages, forage seed or any kind of seed, and also weed-free forages and feed and hay and sanitizing equipment. And also, like Kelly had mentioned, really know what those weeds, their lifestyles and life cycles are for that early detection and monitoring, so you can get that early intervention before it gets away on you. And then again, with the various species of summer annuals, biennials, simple perennials, and the creeping perennials, and is mention of which ones could possibly lend themselves to grazing control, and that would be a great springboard into our next week's presentation with Kathy Botham, which can be grazed. And it's sharing some different personal experiences and seeing what can be brought to the table with that. I don't see any other questions on here.
I'll just mention, you mentioned weed-free forage, and I didn't mention it during the talk, but that program in Alberta just got a major shot in the arm from the hard work of the executive director of the Alberta Invasive Species Council. They sponsored basically training for all county staff in Alberta to take the North American Invasive Species Management Association weed-free forage training, which I actually provided to them. And we had, I believe, in an order of 60 or 70 ag fields or ag service board staff from across the province that took that training on the program and the species that are managed under it. You can see that information about that program through the Alberta Invasive Species Council website, and also through NASMA.org, which is the North American Invasive Species Management Association website. Basically, what the Alberta Invasive Species Council is hoping is that many counties will use these newly trained inspectors to encourage producers in their local counties to grow and certify weed-free forage so that it has availability in the province. That's been something that Alberta Agriculture theoretically was going to do in the past, but maybe didn't do as well as they could have. And with AISC backing it up, we're hoping many counties adopt it. I know Mountain View County, that's represented here today, has had an active program for many years, and I'd like to thank them for that. That's a great program that I'm glad they've maintained as long as they have. So be on the lookout and actually talk to your Ag Service Board fieldman and say, I want to be certified for weed-free forage, and let's get that program going here in Alberta.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I remember years back when that program was just in its infancy, and really rewarding to see how it's taken off and gaining some real positive footholds. If you go into, we've had some additions into the chat box. There's a couple links there. One is with the Wheatland County link that you can visit to get the handy guide for regulated weeds, as well as the link for the weed-free forage on there. So if you go into the chat box, you can access those links as well.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that this session has been recorded, so for those that weren't able to make it today, or for those that were just overwhelmed by all the technical stuff I had in there, if you're focusing in on a couple species, maybe revisiting it. I'm sure that some, or if not all, of the organizations that sponsored today's event will have it available upon request. So hopefully that's the case, and this can be something that has some merit down the road as well, if you revisit some of the specific issues that I talked about during the hour.
And I guess I would suggest to the participants, if you do think of any other questions or have any concerns about any of these weed species or any particular situations, please contact any of us of the organizing partners, and we would try to help get, if we can't answer your questions directly, we would get your answers for you from people such as Kelly. So if there's no other questions, once again, just remind people of the part 2 that is next Tuesday with Kathy Both of Grazing for Weed Control with Livestock on June the 8th. And also, if you can, contact any of us with any of those questions. The other thing is, I do have one question here. It has from an attendee. I heard a few years ago that sandfoin and Sicer milkvetch are going to be listed as noxious weeds. I hope that's not happening, and I have not heard of that situation at all.
Yeah, I have heard of a initiative to try and, not sandfoin, but I have heard Sicer milkvetch as mentioned. Strictly speaking, it's similar to the wild caraway. What some people consider to be a crop can be quite an invasive plant in another situation, and I would actually include alfalfa in that conversation. Certainly sweet clover has proven to be highly invasive in prairie areas, and has actually invaded some prairie rangeland quite heavily. Same thing with sandfoin, alfalfa, Sicer milkvetch, all these forage species that we value from a tame forage point of view, in another situation can be quite a serious weed. I don't think you're going to see government regulate them because of the fact that there's so much economy that's derived from them as forage species. But it is is something to consider just as a good neighbor practice to try and, you know, keep your crops where your crops are and not let them spread down county ditches or into your neighbor's fields. Because again, for some species, if they're non-native and have invasive tendencies, one person's crop can be another person's scourge. So just keep that in mind. And you know, obviously these things have some value, and I don't see them being regulated in Alberta, but they can legitimately be an issue for others.
And I guess that goes to the definition of any plant growing where it's not really wanted or desired could be considered a weed, especially into natural or native areas where we could have domestic forage species become invaders. With that, I think in the interest of our time, again, thank you once again, Kelly, for sharing everything you've had, and for everybody attending today, and also to all the cooperating partners for their efforts in bringing this forward. I hope you got some good value out of today, and I hope to see you all and others on next week. So without any further ado, I'd like to say thank you, enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you again. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good summer.